Throughout the history of literature, there have been authors who, in order to express their vision of the world, their feelings, and their ideas, have used various styles and forms to undertake such a mission. Most have chosen to use romantic and idealistic elements to describe that real or unreal universe in which their worldview rests. However, there have been other authors who, doing the opposite, have used pessimism, the absurd, the grotesque, and even the macabre to echo that damaged world that lives in their minds. A perfect example of this literary form is Franz Kafka, author of the Metamorphosis and the Trial, two works that have earned their place in world literature as must-reads in the contemporary world. Kafka, the protagonist perhaps not of such an intrepid life, did possess a tormented mind, which in his anguish and dissatisfaction created an entire literary style admired and appreciated by several generations. Join us today to explore the life and work of Franz Kafka, author of The Nightmare and the Absurd, and one of history's most renowned writers. My name is Alessandro Polentino, and this is The New Encyclopedia. Before we begin today's story, we want to invite you to support our channel, to subscribe, to leave your like, to leave your comments. We read them all. To share our videos with each of your friends, and to turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. So, without anything else to add, let's begin today's story. Franz Kafka was born on July 3, 1883, into a middle-class Jewish family living in the city of Prague. At that time, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now Austria and Hungary. That empire became one of Europe's largest and most populous nations, and was the world's sixth largest economic and commercial power. At the end of the 19th century, this empire was experiencing, like the rest of Europe, the dizzying changes brought about by the transition from traditional production models to the great industrial and capitalist hubs. Within the historical period known as the Armed Peace, which lasted from 1871 to 1914, and which was characterized by the growing tension between the European powers and by the arms and economic race that developed among them. In Prague, where Kafka was born, the foreign population was mostly made up of Czechs and Germans, as well as an important Jewish community. This cultural diversity was both a source of cultural enrichment for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and at the same time, a source of tensions that was leading to growing nationalism and anti-Semitism. Kafka grew up in that Prague full of social dynamism and multiculturalism, without having to worry much about the economic ups and downs that affected those most disadvantaged by the industrial system, because his family was, in fact, quite well off. However, as a Jew, Kafka always felt alien and uncomfortable, as he would confess in several future writings. As for young Kafka, his upbringing and early years had a decisive influence on his future. The personality of his father, Hermann Kafka, a physically strong and authoritarian man, deeply marked the life of young Franz, causing him a constant feeling of inadequacy. The Kafka family had 6 children, 3 of whom died when Franz was young, making him the eldest of his siblings. These deaths made Kafka taste the bitter flavor of death since he was a child. He was left with a painful realization. This was later shown by ongoing literary references to life's fleeting nature. As the sole surviving son, Kafka becomes the firstborn and heir in a family shaped by grief. His father's expectations of him increase considerably, creating constant pressure that influences his character and his internal conflicts. Thus, his early educational years take place at a German school near the center of Prague, where signs of his withdrawn and deeply reflective personality begin to emerge. As a child, due to his thin and frail build, he showed that weakness that so enraged his father, and that would also bring him a marked insecurity in every step of his life. In a famous letter addressed to his father years later, he reflects this struggle with his parent. Kafka says, I open quotation marks, "Skinny, weak, timid, that's me. You, strong, tall, broad-shouldered, in the booth. "I was ashamed of myself, and not just in front of you, but in front of the whole world, because you were, for me, the measure of all things." End quote. This passage shows one of the recurring reasons for Kafka's tendency toward insecurity regarding his father, a feeling that never left him and that, as an adult, would lead him to prioritize health, outdoor exercise, and good nutrition to improve his physical condition. At the age of 10 in 1893, Kafka entered the gymnasium, the name given to secondary education institutes in Germany, and chose the humanities track. The gymnasium is quite demanding, but even so, Kafka stands out as a good student, although not as an extremely brilliant one. He receives training in subjects such as Latin, Greek, history, and literature, which influence his early interest in philosophical and literary texts. Some classmates described him as reserved and kind, but not very sociable. Biographers have suggested that, beyond his shyness, the issue was that he studied at a mostly Christian school. This made him feel different, and at times marginalized for practicing the Jewish faith. On the other hand, in his diary, Kafka mentions his discomfort with the strict school rules, as he feels repulsed by the harsh discipline of the institute, a major factor shaping his critical view of hierarchies. Also, during this student stage, he feels the constant pressure of not meeting his father's high expectations. Thus, the young Kafka, with a rather sharp intellect even for his age, was experiencing a series of events and experiences that would shape his worldview of the real world, and sooner rather than later, he would express them in his first written works. However, before talking about Kafka's works, it's important to make a brief pause to discuss the literary movement in Prague at that time, of which Kafka was also a witness and participant. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, which coincides with Kafka's youth, a movement known as Expressionism emerged in Europe, especially in Germany. Expressionism arose as a response to rapid industrialization, the uncontrolled growth of cities, and the social dehumanization caused by the rise of technology over human spirituality. This led to widespread pessimism, discontent, and alienation. In this sense, in literature and in the face of a society that seemed to be in decline, Expressionism will be characterized by an intense influence of the emotional and individual, but expressed through elements such as the distortion of reality, symbolism, the nightmarish, the macabre, and the grotesque, and touching on those topics like illness, death, anguish, rejection, and social marginalization. Thus, Kafka, who spends much of his life in major European cities, such as his native Prague and in Berlin, and who also goes through a whirlwind of emotions and complex experiences, is strongly influenced by Expressionism, eventually becoming one of its greatest representatives. Returning to Kafka in 1901 at 18 years old. After graduating from high school, he decides to study chemistry, although this aspiration only lasts 15 days since he ends up choosing to study law in Prague, because of the pressure exerted by his father. During his university years, Kafka starts to surround himself with friends, lovers, and vices, and begins to live a unique routine life, full of torment, but moderately happy. At this time, Kafka reads authors like Goethe, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Flaubert, Voltaire, and others, who will remain foundational to his writing. He also frequents the theater, attends lectures, and participates in activities of various cultural circles at the same time. In October 1902, in a University of Prague classroom, Kafka meets a close friend who, after his death, will even publish his works and will be, with great dedication, his posthumous editor, the young Max Brod. He becomes an indispensable friend to Franz during his university years, with outings to drink, nights in brothels, days spent on literature, and with whom he shares gray nights in the camaraderie and solitude of two companions and friends brought together by fate. In turn, Brod introduced Kafka to a circle of young German-speaking Jewish intellectuals and writers, where they discussed topics of literature, philosophy, and politics. Though shy, This helped Kafka better understand the literary world. In 1904, in a letter to a friend, he explained what literature meant to him, saying, quote, "I think one should only read books that bite and sting you. If the book we read doesn't wake us up with a punch to the skull, then why do we read the book?" Thus denoting his devoted love for books and literature. In 1906, at the age of 23, he graduated and obtained his doctorate in law, starting to work at a law firm in Prague and doing his internships in the criminal courts. The following year, he began to consider various destinations to escape from that monotonous Prague, even thinking about immigrating to South America, a place that fascinated him because of its indigenous peoples and their history. However, for now, his reality forced him to remain in Prague. Later, he was given the opportunity to work at an insurance company, where he himself described his life as a completely disordered life, because it's low-paying and has long hours that leave him feeling endlessly bored. His longing was such that, according to his accounts from this time, he never lost hope of traveling around the world to gaze through windows at new surroundings in order to escape the reality of his work. To decipher in detail Kafka's life and his mediocre, downcast, and weak feelings during these years, one can turn to the many stories he wrote under the influence of the previously mentioned Expressionism. One of the stories that best exemplifies the life of this office worker Kafka is the tale called Poseidon. This story describes Poseidon, the Greek god of the seas, as a being trapped in an endless routine, handling excessive administrative work. Far from enjoying sailing the oceans or ruling majestically, he spent his days reviewing calculations and reports, approving laws, supervising and handling related tasks. The so-called social contract. Of the seas, Poseidon lived frustrated and bitter. Every action on his part was driven by a desire to explore the seas, but his workload consumed him full-time. He could delegate these tasks, but he didn't trust his subordinates. The other gods didn't understand his discontent, since they assumed that his role as Lord of the Seas should be grand and satisfying, and a dream for anyone. This story shows how Kafka uses a mythological figure as an allegory to illustrate the opposite of an all-powerful god. Enjoying his power and majesty, presenting us with a god, in this case Poseidon, as a frustrated, alienated being, eclipsed by the slavery of the bureaucracy he himself created. Making us understand that even so, being a god, one can never escape that tedium of feeling lost. In this sense, during his time working at the insurance company, Kafka is that Poseidon with extraordinary power. To decide about people's future, to meticulously care for each life, but who, despite his power, feels strange. In a letter written to one of his romantic partners, he confesses, I open quotes, "My job is unbearable for me because it contradicts my only desire and my only profession, which is literature. As I am solely literature and wish to remain so, my work will never benefit me and might even ruin me." End quote. In this way, Kafka's greatest wish is to achieve financial independence and have enough free time to write. But the long hours at his job take away his small artistic escapes. He leaves that job in 1908 and joins another insurance company with a more flexible schedule and better pay. He would work here for the next 16 years until his death. In this sense, Kafka's life is not intense, it's not full of great adventures, much less anecdotes worth telling. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's the life of an ordinary man whose love for literature and internal conflicts create a parallel world for him. A particular world full of abstract, distant, lost, and quite absurd signs, outstanding characteristics of what has come to be known as the Kafkaesque element in literature. Thus, in the midst of a monotonous routine at the insurance company and with very few distractions, Kafka, who is already nearing 29 years old, lets his pen run free. Kafka's first published work was in 1912 and is called Contemplation. This work is a collection of short stories about the existential doubts that Kafka feels every day. The first story in this collection is called Children on a Road. It is a short story where Kafka describes a scene in which a group of children play on a rural road. The narrator watches the children with curiosity and nostalgia. As the story progresses, the seemingly simple description of the children's play turns into a reflection on the passage of time. The innocence and disconnection of the adult narrator, contrasted with the innocence of the children's world. The narrator attempts to join the children's game, but quickly realizes he can't share their enthusiasm or freedom. Is there something that separates them? He doesn't feel accepted either, and everything feels strange to him. The children seem to belong to a different world, one that the narrator observes from the outside, unable to fully participate. This distance causes the narrator to feel a sense of isolation and loss, as if he were trapped between nostalgia for lost childhood and the overwhelming reality of adulthood. That story collection gets a timid reception, yet still leaves a mark and testifies to the adult Kafka's sorrows. With a simple prose that is always his own, along with the complexity of his message, his stories will always maintain a magic that is even more disconnected, unique, and paradigmatic to the complexity of the human being. Another key story Kafka wrote during this period is titled A Hunger Artist. It's the story of a man who makes not eating an art form. Within the story, this activity performed by the man is a very successful spectacle. People come fascinated to see him inside a cage, starving. But one day his fame begins to decline as the public prefers more exciting entertainments. The artist feels deeply misunderstood, coming to the realization that leads him to understand that his act was not meant to attract attention. His real reason behind the long days without eating lay in a horrifying fact. He simply can't find any food he likes. In this sense, that artist ends up forgotten and working in a circus that hardly anyone visits. Finally, after his death, his cage is occupied by a panther that does attract the public's attention. This is one of the many profound stories by Kafka that denote existential emptiness, the public's lack of understanding of art, people's indifference, and most importantly, the struggle for a purpose he feels himself. Thus, through these years that pass incredibly quickly, through the overwhelming work routine, with small literary creations and modest success, Franz Kafka will gradually pave the way to publish, the one that unknowingly becomes his masterpiece, and the one that will bring together, in an incredible and monstrous singularity, everything unique about Kafkaesque literature. We're talking about the Metamorphosis. The Metamorphosis was published in 1915 and is a fantastic story of a strange kind of terror. It's not conventional because it doesn't show terror as anxiety caused by some entity or paranormal experience, but rather by an ordinary situation that quickly becomes extraordinary. The story begins one morning when a 29-year-old young man named Gregorio Samsa tries to get up to go to work as usual. He soon discovers the horror of being transformed into a large insect. However, Gregorio is not disoriented. He isn't alarmed by being a monster. Instead, he remains calm and almost indifferent to his transformation. He quickly realizes that he is running late, and despite his new condition, his reaction is automatic because of the need to do his job. However, lying on his back, like the insect he had become, his clumsy legs and heavy body prevent him from getting up and out of bed. Gregor struggles, although his attempts are useless. His parents call him and tell him he's running late. To his parents and his sister, it seems strange that the young man who always fulfills his work is running late. They think he's sick or that he has some problem. They knock on his door and call him. But when trying to respond, Gregorio makes abominable sounds that no one understands. As he insists on getting up, his office manager arrives at his house. Concerned by the unusual delay and ashamed of failing his duty, Gregorio insists on speaking, but his voice is even more inhuman and beastly. He decides not to open the door. Is he more afraid of what the boss will say for not attending his work commitment than of his terrifying condition? As the manager insists, his tone shifts from curiosity to impatience, filling the silence with reproaches about his lack of work commitment. This is, par excellence, the metamorphosis of Gregorio Samsa. Something in his life and routine produced this unhealthy way of thinking, in which his only concern was work, regardless of the minor detail of having suddenly turned into a giant insect. With great effort, Gregorio Samsa manages to peek through the opening of the door, revealing his new form. Upon seeing him, his family and the manager are paralyzed with horror, and without saying a word, the manager flees, leaving Gregorio in a state of confusion over his incomprehensible transformation. Gregorio's family becomes stressed, fearing someone will discover they're hiding such a creature in their home. The father, full of rage, begins to detest Gregorio, seeing him as something abominable and dehumanizing his son. The mother, despite her compassion and fear, still believes he is her son. For her part, his sister, Greta, though initially disgusted, overcomes her fear to feed and care for him. One day, Greta and his mother decide to remove everything from Gregorio's room to make it easier for him to move around the walls and ceiling, something he begins to enjoy. When Gregorio sees that they are about to take away a painting he deeply appreciates, he decides to cling to it, placing himself over the painting. A desperate, inhuman act he felt was being taken from him. When they return to the room, his mother and Greta see him in that clinging position, which causes his mother to faint. Greta runs to get help, and Gregorio, worried about his mother's fainting, tries to follow her to help and explain that he doesn't want to hurt them. Greta quickly returns, locks Gregorio in the room, and tells her father what happened. The father, interpreting the situation as a hostile act by Gregorio towards the family, reacts with anger, deciding to defend his family. In a violent outburst, he hurls apples at him to make him back off. One of those apples hits Gregorio hard in the back, embedding itself in his shell and causing him deep pain. This episode is crucial to understanding the break in Gregorio's relationship with his family, intensifying the feeling of rejection and misunderstanding. Gregorio's family, over time, grows increasingly distant from the creature. His wound gets infected, but no one cares for him. His pain grows because he can no longer support his family as he did with his job. To survive, Gregorio's family decides to rent out part of their home to some people, making the household feel even heavier. The relationship between Gregorio and his family is destroyed. There is no hope for him. On those afternoons when he has no other thoughts left, Gregorio suffers in silence, imagining what would have happened if he weren't that horrible monster. Would he have paid for his sister's college, helped his father, or spoiled his mother? No one understands him, and there's not even the slightest bit of affection. One night, Gregorio, weak and overcome by loneliness, is drawn to the melody of the violin his sister is playing in the living room. After a long time, he feels overwhelmed and decides to approach his beloved sister. His appearance was unexpected, causing a terrible commotion. The tenants decide to leave, upset by the situation. Desperate and in tears, Greta suggests getting rid of Gregorio. There was nothing they could do for him. Though sad, the family accepts, believing they've done all they could for him. Gregorio hears and understands the rejection. Soon he begins to feel weak from going days without eating and is found dead the next day by the maid. She disposes of him as if he were something unimportant. The conversation about the monster's death is indifferent, and a huge sense of relief falls over the Samsa family. Gregor's body was completely flat, dry, and unable to support his legs. Finally, freed from the burden that Gregor represented, the Samsa family goes out for a walk together full of optimism for a new beginning, bringing the story to an end. Among biographers, philologists, and scholars, there are those who see in the Metamorphosis the problem of an authoritarian father, the demands and responsibilities that Kafka faced throughout his life. There are others who see in Gregor Samsa the crisis of Franz Kafka's 20s, a time when many young people feel lost and hopeless, and where they feel overwhelmed by new responsibilities, slowly losing their sense of self. Others suggest the implication that Gregorio Samsa represents those young people like Kafka with no sense of belonging. That is, those who see themselves as a burden in their family circles. A feeling that affects not only young people, but also the sick, elderly, and those who are depressed, who are symbols of this monster. However, regardless of the cultural perspective from which it is judged, in the Metamorphosis, the presence of that marked expressionism can be observed, with its grotesque, absurd, and nightmarish characters, embodied in the mere presence of the monster Gregorio Samsa, which characterizes much of Kafka's works. Nevertheless, the Metamorphosis is not the only masterpiece by Kafka, but it shares this title with the novel called The Trial, written almost at the same time as the Metamorphosis, but published posthumously by his friend Max Brod. In this novel, we are introduced to a man named Joseph K., who is a respected bank manager. When he wakes up one morning, he sees two police officers in his room who inform him that he is being prosecuted. They do not explain the reason for his arrest or the charges against him. Joseph, confused and having done nothing wrong, asks, "What am I being accused of?" The officers do not answer him and only say, quote, "You are being prosecuted." The officers leave, and meanwhile he is left stunned, wondering what crime he committed. But he can't come up with any logical reason for why he is being judged. Joseph is dragged through the judicial system, starting a long odyssey of interrogations in old offices. Surrounded by bureaucrats, judges, lawyers, and bailiffs, corrupt, indifferent, and incompetent in their duties, Joseph insists on finding justice and an answer to his case, but all he discovers is a labyrinth of hierarchical levels whose officials respond to him. They tell him to keep asking, that his case is in the hands of a superior, and that he should find out which court is accusing him. Joseph enters a state of uncertainty because he is not allowed to know who is accusing him, what crime he is being charged with, or even how to defend himself. In this maze of bureaucracies and hierarchies, nothing makes sense. One day he receives a visit from his uncle who, worried about the situation, takes him urgently to lawyers who specialize in cases like his. However, this man is old, ill, and offers no hope. Joseph, tired of seeing no progress, decides to take control of his own defense. As the process moves forward, Joseph feels more and more sunk in despair. One of the characteristics of this work is that none of the secondary characters are helpful at all. Beyond suggestions like postponing the procedure or having some vague concern for Joseph, but in themselves they are completely absent, almost like mere ghosts. In one of the passages of the play, Joseph, wandering anxiously, encounters a priest who explains to him a parable known as, I quote, "Before the law, in which a man spends his whole life waiting to enter through a door that, according to a guard, is meant only for him. This is access to the law, but whenever the person nears the entrance, the guard stops him, telling him that he cannot pass at the moment, that maybe he can pass later. The man keeps trying and wondering if he'll ever cross. The firm guard warns him that if he tries, there will be more guards inside, each one more powerful than the last. The man, afraid of the dangers that have been described to him, chooses to stay in front of the door, waiting and waiting. Over the years, the man grows old without losing any hope of entering through the door. Almost at the point of death, the man gathers his last strength and asks the guard, "Why? Though everyone seeks the law, has anyone tried to cross the door?" The guard, before closing the door forever, reveals to him, quote, "This door was meant only for you. Now I am going to close it," end quote. Joseph tries to understand the meaning of this parable, but he doesn't come to any logical answer. The conversation with the priest reinforces his feeling of helplessness and of having no relief. Before Joseph leaves, the priest says these words to him, open quotes, "Justice wants nothing from you. It takes you when it comes and leaves you when you go," close quotes. After this, Some time passes, and two men come to look for Joseph. They take him and bring him to the outskirts of the city, and without any explanation, execute him. In his final moments, Joseph doesn't rebel or try to resist. He accepts his fate with resignation, as if he had finally accepted guilt he never acknowledged for a crime he didn't commit, bringing the play to an end. In this work, we can see that element of the absurd in Kafkaesque literature. During Joseph K's trial, nothing makes sense. Everything is illogical, and the endless hierarchical structures are infested with an inefficient bureaucracy that alienates man both mentally and physically, reducing him to just another pawn in the modern system. Shorten the text by up to 18%. Preserve meaning in speaker's perspective. Retain all proper names and events. Ensure grammatical correctness. Do not add or infer missing information. Shorten text. Although Kafka had a prolific life and undeniable literary talent, he would not live much longer. As we mentioned, he spent most of his life writing and working at the modest insurance company in Prague. Some specific aspects of his life indicate certain emotional and affective disorders, presumably caused by the undisguised disdain that his father maintained toward him throughout his life. These aspects we mentioned are his love life. This is because Kafka had no wife or children, and he frequently visited the brothels in his city and had several encounters with multiple lovers. Despite this, he was engaged and close to marrying Felice Bauer, a Polish girl with whom Kafka left a correspondence of more than 500 letters and postcards. However, he never ended up marrying her because, as Kafka himself told Felice's father, he was an extremely sickly, talkative person and devoted to literature. He would repeat this same pattern with some fleeting partners throughout his life, the last of them named Dora Diamant. In his last months of life, she made Kafka rekindle the interest he thought was extinct in his religion, that is Judaism. By Christmas 1923, Kafka contracted severe pneumonia, forcing him to return to his parents' house in March 1924. Quickly, the illness turned into laryngeal tuberculosis, which took away his ability to speak and made swallowing food very painful for Kafka. Even so, with his health fading away progressively, he kept writing tirelessly. His final wishes were to mislead his parents about how close he was to death, and he also asked his friend Max Brod that after his death he should burn all his letters, stories, and novels that hadn't been published. Finally, on the afternoon of June 3, 1924, he died at the age of 40, a rather ordinary man who believed he hadn't done much in his life. But deep down, with the name Franz Kafka, he would be considered a semi-paternal light that paved the way to understanding the human condition through literary movements like modernism and existentialism. Abstract, often alienated and absurd by nature, Franz Kafka was shaped by his circumstances, fears, and sorrows. Albert Camus, father of absurdism and admirer of his work, said these words about Kafka. I quote, "The genius of Kafka is an awakened sleeper, the author of a work that offers him everything, but at the same time confirms nothing." End quote. This summarizes the Kafkaesque nature of Kafka himself. His work managed to reach us in its entirety thanks to his friend Max Brod, who disobeyed the dying man's command. Kafka, by publishing his literary creations posthumously, achieved resounding success, making Kafka a must-read author and a strong source of inspiration for several renowned writers of the 20th century. Kafka, perhaps in his incessant insecurity and self-loathing, never realized in his lifetime what almost every reader in the world who has read his works has understood: his great talent for capturing with his pen the greatest dilemmas of human existence through the surreal, the ambiguous, and the illogical. Dear friends, thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. We hope you enjoyed it. Your support is vital to this project's growth. That's why we invite you to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share our content with all your friends, and stay tuned for our upcoming releases. See you next time.